Hello there. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education. And in today's Right to Read Initiative conversation, I'm talking to Carla McNeil about how leadership needs to definitely be part in this role in the transition from a balanced literacy approach of instruction towards that structured literacy, science of reading, or what it really is an instruction based on how the brain learns to read. Hi, Carla, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Kathryn. It's lovely to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Why don't you take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Learning Matters?
Sure, thank you. So good morning or good afternoon to everybody. I am Carla McNeil, the Managing Director from Learning Matters in New Zealand. So I'm an education consultant currently working with a team of consultants across New Zealand, where we work with 56 schools across the country to implement structured literacy and work through exactly that change process you were just talking about, Kathryn, from supporting teachers and school leaders to shift from a balanced literacy approach into a structured literacy approach. I'm also the founder of the Ideal Approach to Structured Literacy, which has been an initiative to really ensure that teachers and school leaders have the right supports in place to support them with that shift. So really looking forward to this conversation with you today, where we have the opportunity to consider all of the stakeholders through this change process, and also the role, I guess, of the various leaders, the leaders that sit within the school setting, the leaders I know in your case that sit at district level, and then of course the leaders that sit at that really sort of key driving level of policy and curriculum documents at both ministry and government level. So yeah, thank you so much for having me join you today.
Wonderful. So in this conversation, we're going to try and hit 5 of the different recommendations from the Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read Public Inquiry report. So I'm just going to quickly and briefly go through these, not in any detail. If you are looking for these recommendations, they can be found on the Right to Read in the appendix. And when this replay is posted both on the Garforth Education, the Right to Read Initiative website, YouTube, and now it's going to be available as a podcast on the Right to Read Initiative podcast. There will be references to these recommendations. So the first one has to do with the ministry being responsible for providing funding for literacy learning leads to help coordinate and support this improvement related to reading and literacy. And it should require that the leaders be trained in the science of reading, including systematic and direct instruction in foundational reading skills and structured literacy approaches. We also want to make sure that the College of Teachers, or depending on where you are, the professional association that's in charge of teachers, need to make sure that any of the additional qualification courses available on reading do have advanced knowledge in a variety of areas related to structured language and literacy. We want to make sure that any of these courses are including information for our diverse learners in special education and those with additional exceptionalities. We would like to make sure that the ministry isn't just looking internally for this support. They want to look to experts out there in the field like Carla, myself, and other individuals who have made this their life work to understand how to do this process, especially when we're talking about the early reading instruction, individuals with reading disabilities and dyslexia. So we want to make sure that we have a comprehensive, sustainable approach to this. And finally, we want to make sure that this is part of yearly funding that is available to schools so that we can continue this job embedded professional learning, because the science of reading, structured language and literacy, reading science, whatever you want to call it, it's not a boxed program. It's based on current evidence-based practices and neuroimaging studies. So it is going to change and evolve, and we have to make sure that the support is in place to continue the learning. There's also been research that has shown that making this transition isn't going to happen automatically after a one-day training seminar. It happens over time. And there's a quote that I like from a seminar that I was at recently from Kareem Weaver that said, this isn't a lunch break thing. So it's not something that you're going to get a whole school on board and changed just through, a weekly lunch and learn. This is a continual, ongoing process that requires a bigger and more holistic approach. And that's where I'm hoping that Carla can help provide guidance, because it's something that she's been working on and doing in New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think really what you're saying is that we need a strategy behind this, and we need strategy at various levels. So I just want to first and foremost acknowledge those recommendations from the Right to Read initiative, and highlight, as we discussed before we came on to this chat, that one of the key differences with the Right to Read inquiry is the specificity that sits within these recommendations. That is something that is very, very unique to this document. And I must say, Kathryn, that as you were reading through those recommendations, this little thing inside me got very, very excited, because if any country in this world, or if all countries across the globe, were able to achieve those recommendations, what a significant shift we would see in the outcomes and the literacy outcomes for all of our students right across the country. So I really want to begin by acknowledging the significance of those recommendations.
Yeah.
Then if we think about,
I was just going to say, those are only
then if we think about,
them, right?
Yeah.
So they go even more detail about how we need to look at the resources that we're using in our curriculum and our pre-service training. It's fully written out as a step-by-step thing that we can follow to make improvements. So if we think about, I guess, really, leading our conversation into how do we go about bringing those recommendations to light? What are the things that we need to consider to actually make those things happen? And, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be nice if we did have really clear direction from government and ministry, where we had curriculum documents that just came out and outlined all of those steps, and we had everything, I'm going to say, we have this expression in New Zealand, honky-dory. That means everything's okay and it's all good to go and it's evidence-based. But what we know is that that is not the case. And we actually fundamentally know, I believe, that the responsibility doesn't in fact lie with any one stakeholder alone, that what's going to create this evidence-based shift, and what is creating this evidence-based shift here in New Zealand, is where
all stakeholders are standing up and saying, I need to know about this evidence-based stuff. And acknowledge their discomfort, particularly when they are a classroom teacher and have been teaching balanced literacy for 20 years, or in our case here in New Zealand, are a reading recovery teacher and, are so wedded to that way of instruction and those resources and that way of being. So I think the first part of the very first step is that we need engagement from all stakeholders, from parents, from classroom teachers, from school leaders, from your district leaders. In your case, in our case, we call them our cluster principal leaders. Obviously from ministries of education, and also from our government, because wouldn't it be nice to think that this is where we could see that education and the teaching of literacy is about the settled science and not about the politics that might push a party one way or another. So then if we have all of those stakeholders, Kathryn, putting their hands up and leaning into this conversation, I think that's going to be a really great step forward towards building a more evidence-based approach. I do want to point out that one of the things that we do often see and experience here in New Zealand is frustration to the nth degree. Frustration from parents, frustration from classroom teachers, frustration from school leaders. Sadly, we don't see the same level of frustration at ministry and government level, because they too seem to be wedded to the balanced literacy approach in many respects. But the reason I bring up the frustration is because, like you said, this change is not going to occur from some lunchtime professional learning sessions. This change will occur from carefully planned professional learning over a number of years. So when I think about the schools here in New Zealand that are what we call our flagship schools, who have moved from balanced literacy to a structured literacy approach, it has taken them 3 years to truly go from that place where they are developing their knowledge and their practice, to embedding their knowledge and practice, to then being able to sustain that knowledge and practice. So there's those steps of going from developing to embedding to sustaining are where we all need to get to truly be able to say we actually are a school who practice structured literacy with fidelity, and that our practice is completely evidence-based in our tier 1, our tier 2, and our tier 3 instruction. So we need change across all of those stakeholder levels. But I would bring to the table too this analogy of a train and the different carriages within the train. So if we think of our train as having 3 carriages, and we think of the people within the train as being the teachers and the leaders within the school, I'm sure you observe this too, Kathryn, where you see that there are some people in the front carriage of the train who are really driving that train forward. And we might term those people as our early adopters through this change process. And then we have some people in the second carriage, and those people are kind of also what you might call our fence sitters. They're sort of looking to the front carriage where the people are so knowledgeable and increasing their practice in structured literacy. And then they also look back to the third carriage where people are really staying wedded to their balanced literacy approach. So I often use this analogy of a train in schools and conversations with classroom teachers, with parents, with school leaders, talking to them about being really open and honest about which carriage of the train are you sitting in. And that leads me into, one of the most amazing principals I've had the privilege to work alongside here in New Zealand. She clearly states the importance of not rushing this process of implementation, of having a planned strategy and a planned implementation model for what you will do over a period of time to take people with you, and not to be afraid to lean into dialogue that is uncomfortable and challenges your fundamental beliefs about how the brain learns to read. Because if we can't do that, how will we ultimately come to that place of changing our practice?
Yes, of course. And I came across some research from the 90s actually about the relationship between the type of training and the impact that it has. And while it's really important to make sure that teachers, principals, vice principals, and the higher ups understand the theory, even if they have 85% of mastery, they're only going to understand how to actually use the skill by about 15%. And in the classroom, we're only going to see like a 5 or 10% change. If we give them a little bit of practice, it bumps up to a 10 to 15% change. So if they're having one class and a little bit of experience with a practicum or some sessions where they're working with a couple students, you're going to see just a little bit, maybe maximum 15% change. But when we're looking at this more holistic view and add in the coaching, learning teams, and peer visits into this, that's where we get the 80 to 90% change. So it's understanding that if we just say, okay, here's the course, you need to go and take it, it's all going to be fixed. It's just a band-aid solution, right? And that principle that
absolutely, yeah,
saying that this is a slow process, it really is. And there are concepts that have been missing from our teachers' education programs that have been around for decades, that are foundational theories that really help the understanding of reading. I'm sure the ones that I'm thinking of are coming up in your head. I mean, the simple view of reading in Scarborough's reading should be something that every teacher knows and understands. But there are a lot of current teachers that have never heard of them, or maybe they've seen them in passing on a Facebook group.
Absolutely.
Something, but they don't really understand it. And it's until they understand the aspects that we need to facilitate in our students and how the brain plays a role in this, we're not going to see the change.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that, if we can just go back to for a moment on something that I mentioned earlier and what you've just mentioned around the importance of strategy or implementation planning, is that one of the things that works really, really well here with the schools that we are leading through change with here in New Zealand is that we actually sit down together and we craft what this change leadership process looks like. And it includes the what, the why, and the how. And we always begin with the why. Why is it important that we learn about structured literacy? So we go back to the data and the realization that if we continue to do what we've always done, we will continue to get what we've always got. And then why is this change necessary in terms of the function of how the brain learns to read? We can obviously dip into building knowledge, and really focusing on helping teachers to understand the theory, like you mentioned, of how the brain does learn to read. But I agree, Kathryn, with you when you say that if we just have that one-day course of a little bit of the theory, or even if we introduce a resource and just, I'm going to say, dump a resource on a table, the actual gold of this structured literacy approach, or the gold of really truly embedding evidence-based explicit structured literacy practice, is the ability of the teacher to know how to respond based on the response that the student has given. So that really honing of formative teaching practice is so crucial for change to happen in classroom practice. And so when we're building strategy, implementation plans, whatever we want to call it, a professional learning model for change, it's so important that classroom teachers and school leaders actually create a roadmap that's going to include learning about new things, the theory, practicing those things, having a coach walk alongside you and give you feedback and feed forward, and then videoing your practice and reflecting on your own practice and, thinking about what that looks like. And then further to that, from a school picture perspective, when schools really, really have this well-oiled train with everybody in the front carriage, they have a literacy leader who can specialise in supporting other people in their school in this area of structured language and literacy instruction, because they've built that throughout the implementation process. So it is so important that we be strategic about this change leadership process. So that's the school piece. And then you mentioned something else. You started to talk about, teachers in pre-service.
Before we move on, there is a question relating to the train analogy. So I thought I'd put it in now when we were talking about it. The question was, did the balanced literacy teachers in the third car participate in the first year training and implementation?
Say the last part of the question again, sorry.
Did the balanced literacy teachers in the third car participate in the first year of training and implementation?
Oh, yes, they did. Yes, they did. Yeah, they did. So when we implement whole school instruction here in New Zealand, everybody participates, obviously. But what is worth noting is that here in New Zealand, schools come to the transformational change of structured literacy in different ways. Some schools come with just the junior teachers coming on board. Some schools come with an intervention focus first, and some schools come whole school. Our preference, of course, is whole school, because we can get such a greater reach and we can see right across the board in terms of where teachers are sitting. But that depends entirely on funding and the school's ability to come into this. So, when we look at recommendation 45, and that recommendation 45 states that, funds should be given to professional learning and ongoing professional learning in this area, I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yes, and the awareness that it's going to take different individuals different times, because I'm sure it was the same incidents for you down there, is that we have teachers that have started this journey on their own. So these teachers are starting ahead of the game, ahead of the pack, and may already be a few years into this transition and have that knowledge. Well, they can become those leaders within the school to bring the school forward. I was speaking to a teacher earlier this week that was the only teacher in her school, and she just started learning about it in the summer, but she noticed such huge change in her students. She's like, well, there's no way I can go back. It's just not going to happen. And, next year, what's the teacher going to think when she's like, oh my goodness, these kids know so much more than the kids that I got from you last year did. What happened? And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, Kathryn, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that there are a great deal of teachers doing this on their own within a school setting right across the globe. And I hear exactly that statement that you said too, I can't go back. Now that I know how to teach this way, I've been able to move students who have been at what we call here in New Zealand a targeted learner or a tier 2 or a tier 3 learner. I've actually been able to support them to make progress like never before. They've been at school for 5 years, and they've never made the progress in that 5 years that they have made in the last 6 to 12 months of this teaching. So I think we need to really encourage those teachers who are in that front carriage, but they're actually there all on their own, to find their community within another school. Or, there are so many great Facebook groups out there, but to find their community and their people that can help to continue to give them the strength, continue to give them the energy. They don't need the motivation, because the motivation comes from the progress they see in their students. but this is tiring. It's unrelenting in terms of trying to spread that shift right across the school. And so I just really wanted to acknowledge all of those individual teachers who are doing that, because, you know, what they may not realize is they are pivotal in the spreading of this evidence-based shift. And we all want to be here to support them, because they will help other teachers to get into the position where they are, and then those teachers, you know, it's a real sort of flow-on effect, isn't it? But those teachers need support. They need to find their support community.
Exactly. But we need to speed up the process. We don't need it to take 10 or 15 years of slowly creeping there with the one teacher here and then a couple teachers there. We need to make it so this is systematic and not just one school doing it, not just one district doing it, but across the province, across the country, across the world, really, because
absolutely.
Every child does have the right to read. It is a basic human right. And we need to do everything that we can to make sure that their learning needs are met. So can you take a moment to tell us how this all got started in New Zealand and what we might learn from what you guys have done, and any tips for going forward and how we can do it?
Yeah, this really started in New Zealand by two key people driving quality into evidence-based intervention structures forward across the country. People started seeing what was going on there, and then schools started asking and responding to that. You know, Kathryn, I think one of the key drivers is being able to connect with school leaders. In New Zealand, I'm not exactly sure how your funding model works in Ontario or in other states across the world, really, but school leaders in New Zealand have the autonomy to drive things forward. So when we think about where those different stakeholders are positioned, from parents to teachers to school leaders, ministry, government, school leaders are pivotal in this shift. They are able to really pick this up and they are able to run with it. So if we come back to what we were just talking about with that individual teacher being the lone teacher in their school, the person that they must sidle up to the most is their school leader. The person that parents must sidle up to most is their school principal. And in communities where we have school leaders that are adopting a structured literacy approach and we have other school leaders who aren't, the school leaders who are must sidle up to and share this information with those school leaders. I have this little saying, Kathryn, and with all due respect, it comes from a place of ultimate respect, because I have been a classroom teacher, I have been a school principal, I understand the complexities of being in those roles, but I also understand that when we have no direction from a ministry, no clear direction for teaching and learning that is evidence-based, all we lead into is roles of self-employed teaching and learning. We have teachers choosing what they believe is the best way to teach based on their beliefs. And then we know their beliefs become their thoughts become their actions, and their actions become the outcomes of all of our students right across the globe. So what we need is, I agree with you wholeheartedly, again, we need structured literacy to be present in our curriculum. And so one of the key shifts that we have implemented here in New Zealand with school leaders is we have the ability to write our own what we call local curriculum. So schools in New Zealand, Kathryn, are not waiting for our ministry or government to rewrite the curriculum. We don't have time for that here either. Whilst I talk about the different parts of the train and supporting teachers who are in isolation, I am also a key driver driving individual schools as whole community sectors to write their curriculum. That curriculum, from the school in Wellington to the school in Auckland to the school in the different parts of New Zealand, looks very, very, very much the same. The fundamentals of the curriculum are the same. There'll be slight nuances that are different because of the different settings and the different demographics and how intense they need to be. But I just really wanted to share that with you because we can't wait. We can't wait for this shift to occur. We need to actually get on, and we need to be thinking about how can we take this learning? How can we take the theory? How can we take the scope and sequence that's being advised that we do use and follow to provide the content and the order for teaching? How can we ensure that we have a robust system for classroom modelling and observations of lessons and feedback sessions and coaching? How can we ensure that all of that is really watertight in our school documents?
Definitely. And unfortunately, in Canada, it's up to the province and the Ministry of the Education to create that curriculum. And a lot of our curriculums are still very much heavily entrenched in the balanced literacy, multi-cueing approach to reading. And the school resources are those, the Fontes and Pinnell, the predictable text, the level readers. And that's a real issue that we're having. We're still having reading recovery used in a lot of our schools. And that was another thing I wanted to ask you is how do you address that need for change with all this money invested in balanced literacy programs, balanced literacy training, and balanced literacy resources? I mean, teachers have stacks of leveled textbook or leveled readers that teach their students, but what are they supposed to do with them, and how are they supposed to replace them?
So here in New Zealand, what happens is we definitely lean into those conversations, and we like to lean into them pretty early. What happens is we when we embark on this change leadership process with schools going into structured literacy, we let them know right from the outset that if you choose to go with us on this transformational change, you will be required to not use those level texts for your students that are in the first 2 years of their schooling. So there are no surprises, and I think that's something that's really important for us to be aware of as well. We have to be really open and honest, and we have to be able to have that dialogue even before this process starts. What will be the things that we need to, as classroom teachers and as school leaders, to be aware of that's going to be very different in this process? And then we see that real spread across the train, Kathryn. We see people run and clutch for the back carriage, which, you can understand. But then we share with them the process that we're going to go through and when that change will come into effect. We're not going to change everything in the first school term or the first 2 school terms. We're going to do that over time. So by the time we come to do that, the understanding is deeper, the acceptance is greater, and people are much more ready to lean into shifting that. So our schools take all of those level texts that are, the colour wheel texts, and they put them somewhere else, and they use them to go home and reading book bags for parents to read to their children at home. And they, part of this process too then is really about communicating with our families about what these changes are and why these changes are taking place. So again, that needs to be strategically placed in our roadmap. When is the right time to start communicating with our parents about what is different? And, some parents come back and they say, oh, this is so logical. It makes so much sense. I get it now. And other parents really push back. And, they do that because they need to know more. They need to know more. And so we have to be responsive to that pushback because it tells us about where that parent's sitting and how well we have and haven't communicated with them.
Yeah. And I think also I'm seeing pushback depending on how the parents or how the teachers learned how to read themselves. Individuals who don't remember learning how to read have a harder time accepting the process that it takes for an individual who is struggling to learn how to read. And they don't realize that their brain went through those same exact processes. It was just so much easier for them. But when you see, a star athlete that, we gave them, say, a golf club at birth, and they could, I guess Tiger Woods, like not everybody's a Tiger Woods.
Yeah.
I think that reference might
Absolutely.
work in New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
There are people that take forever to try and figure out how to swing the club and get the ball, and there are a lot who never make a hole in one.
Totally. But what we do know is that Tiger practiced a lot, right? And so just like Tiger practiced a lot, when we teach those parents that actually the way your brain did in fact learn to read is the same way, we now know exactly how your brain did learn to read. And we're going to teach your child and every other child in a way that we don't leave reading to chance, and that we really do ensure we activate every part of that reading network through this reading instruction, instead of us just thinking that we learn through repetition and seeing a word a number of times. We now know that's not the case. And yeah, so I think definitely, informing them all about that is really crucial, is a really, really crucial part of this process. Kathryn, I just want to come back to something you said earlier about the importance of pre-service teacher training. And, that is definitely in part of these recommendations. And as I was thinking about coming on to this discussion with you today, I was thinking about the reality here in New Zealand, sadly, is that we still have teachers in teacher training who are being taught to teach reading using a balanced literacy approach. And so we're sort of in this really interesting phase. We have, we are a very, very small country, but we have around 15% of schools in New Zealand now that are adopting a structured literacy approach in some way, shape or form. They'll be in a different place from their developing, embedding, sustaining kind of pathway. But what we experience is that teachers train and they invest a lot of money to do their teacher training, and a lot of them come out with an awful lot of debt at the end of their 4 years here in New Zealand to be a teacher. And then they go into a classroom, and there's really these sort of two possibilities when they go out into a classroom. They go out into a classroom and that practices a balanced literacy approach, and it mirrors what they've learned in their school, and off they go on their way. And or they go out into a school that's a structured literacy approach, and they dig their heels in and they say, why was I never taught this? Why was I actually never taught how the brain learns to read? So you mentioned earlier the importance of there being a real strong correlation between the theory that's being taught in pre-service education and the practical components when teachers go on their teaching sections and or when they go out into the classroom. And this is an ongoing conversation that's being had here in New Zealand at both ministry and government level, the need for there to be a very clear direction around what must be included in pre-service teacher training. And the recommendation around this from the Right to Read inquiry is the very clearest that I have seen anywhere. So what I know won't be adopted here in New Zealand without, I don't know, I just can't see it happening. What I don't see happening is that we will be able to mandate and say for pre-service teacher training, structured literacy must be taught in every pre-service teacher training course. But what I do see will be the specifics, like you have in the Right to Read inquiry recommendations, the importance of teachers understanding the role of phonological and phonemic awareness, and then how to teach how to actually teach those skills through various tasks, the role of spelling and learning to read. All of those finer bits that are in those recommendations are so crucial. And I'm reflecting on that, Kathryn, if I'm honest, and I'm thinking about how we can use that recommendation here in New Zealand to go back and advise our ministry and government too around that pre-service teacher training component. And then the other thing that you did mention was about, teacher certification. And so here in New Zealand, you're under this sort of like probationary period of 2 years. You come out of your teacher training and then you have 2 years to meet all of the requirements to be a registered teacher. And wouldn't it be nice to see that part of that registration process actually includes being able to meet the requirements as listed in these recommendations? So, perhaps that's something that school leaders and, in your case, your district level can be thinking about. How do we sign off and give these teachers certification? Is it in line with this? And then that ongoing professional learning that we talked about earlier, but what I think we can see from this is there is a pipeline for teachers. There is a professional pipeline or a professional pathway for teachers, isn't there? And perhaps what we need to be thinking about as those who advocate in this area and those who speak to ministry officials or district officials and government officials is, where are we going to put our eggs in the first instance to create the biggest shift? And in my mind, that biggest shift is going to come in the first instance by working with the existing teachers in schools, because they're right there right now doing this. Every country has limited resourcing, sadly. So where do we make that biggest impact first and foremost?
Well, and the impact and the money invested is going to pay exponentially in returns, right?
Absolutely.
The cost of illiteracy, or having a functionally illiterate population, is extreme, and the problems that these individuals have long term go beyond not being able to read. There's issues with self-esteem, mental health issues.
Absolutely.
And it is a big cost to society. And unfortunately, most governments only have their elected term in mind when they're looking at making changes. And when we see that shift takes 3 to 5 years, well, that's all right. That's someone else's term. I'm not concerned about that. And it's making them say, okay, I am concerned about that, because it is, the people of my country, my province, my city, whatever. I'm trying to make the biggest impact and the best decisions for these individuals long term. And I'm not just concerned about those years that I am currently elected for.
And to add to that too, I think what's missing in terms of the commitment to this at a leadership level is we need to take note of what's here right now, as opposed to being wedded to something that's comfortable for us. And I know that people will find that potentially to be quite a pointing comment, but it's true, Kathryn. This is about, actually, we all need to sit in that place of having a strong sense of moral purpose, that we chose to come into this. We all chose to come into education. Ministers chose to be a minister leading education. Governments chose to direct policy. And as classroom teachers, we chose to. So, I think, again, so much of this is about the power of communication and ability in communication to actually be able to converse in a way that's very respectful, but at the same time, we've got a crisis on our hands that needs to be dealt with right across the globe. And I don't know, well, I do know about you. I was going to say, I don't know about you, but I do know about you because I know about your work. And like you say, we all commit our life's work to this. So what we all want is the very best for children. So let's lean into whatever stakeholder we are. Let's be really okay to lean into the conversation that's going to make the biggest difference for our children. Because one thing I would say to all of the teachers and all of the parents and all of the school leaders and everybody out there, this is actually not about you as an individual. This is about our children. And we have to put our children first. And we have to do what is the best thing for them. And sometimes doing what is the best thing for them is what's hardest for us.
And that's very true. And we need to understand that when we chose this profession or this career path, we committed to be lifelong learners. It's no longer the case where you can work in a one-room schoolhouse, teaching the same curriculum, the same materials every year out of the same textbook with the same resources. You need to adapt and change and follow what is considered best practice, just as medical professionals are expected to do, and legal professionals, other professionals are expected to keep up with this and know what is current, not what was based on their training. And we need to pass that on to the teachers. Of course, we know that they will be doing what they feel is in best interest of their students. And at one point, people may have thought that it was.
Absolutely.
Now we know that it isn't, and that word needs to spread like wildfire. We need to realize that we need to make changes. We need to be okay with those changes being one bite at a time. We're not trying to eat this big elephant of a literacy and structured literacy, structured science of reading. We're not trying to eat the whole thing at a time. We're just trying to take little bites at a time, manageable bites, and having a group eat it, if you're using that. But there are so many different ways that we can all play a little role to help make this problem much smaller. And as we chip away at it and we see the progress that the students are making, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I've worked with a struggling reader who finally starts getting it and understanding, the excitement is contagious. And we see this even in adults who are learning how to read, right? Or teenagers. It's not that this isn't going to be a rewarding process or journey for you to go on. It's humbling, and it causes you to maybe feel regret. I know many of the big names in this field talk about a time where they didn't know this information. They didn't have it. And that moment where they realized, have I been doing this wrong for so many years? And there is that sense of guilt, but you can't do anything more than you've been trained to do. You have to be willing to expand your knowledge and your understanding of best practices in order to progress and move your students forward. And that's why we are lifelong learners.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And sometimes that's easier than others. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult, and that's okay. I think it's where we just keep that talk alive around where we're at. And just to add to what you've said too, Kathryn, I think, you know, the most important thing is for all of us to keep this conversation alive. This is not going away. This is not going away. This is a snowball that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And either, you know, in some respects, join in with our snowball, or the snowball's going to take you. Because it is, right? We see that. I mean, we see that here in New Zealand. It's just the feedback from teachers and teachers that have been teaching for 20 or 30 years that truly now feel like they can teach those students that sit across from them. It's so empowering for teachers, so rewarding, let alone the impact for the actual student and the student's family.
Definitely. And that's why I've created this Right to Read initiative to help be that global force, keeping the conversation going so it doesn't fade away and people realize that we are serious about that. And we do have a document that we can reference wherever we are in the world to look for a guideline, a map that's got most things laid out. Yes, there may need to be tweaks here and there given new research and location, but it can be used. So if you'd like to join me on a conversation,
Absolutely.
reach out. And I want to be conscious of time, but before we go, there is a question, and it's about what you've been doing. And they're wondering if it has all been financed by the school boards and ministries of education, or have there been private or corporate donations to support the training provisions of resources?
No, there haven't been private or corporate donations. It has all been through the school, what the question said around the school board or the Ministry of Education.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today or tomorrow, depending where you are. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that we can stay in touch and talk again. On the replay, we will have the contact information for Carla if you're wanting to know more about her and what she does. And I think everybody should have a great day.